Welcome to the Twisted Testament. This is the first video in a series that will continue through the year. In this series, we're exploring how a Jewish sect was twisted into a Roman imperial religion, and how this transformation was the seed for the oppressive Christianities we're grappling with today. Not to say all Christianities are oppressive, but the many that are. In the course of exploring the ancient Hebrew origins of modern Christianity, some people might get the mistaken impression that all the bad stuff in Christianity is Jewish. That's an argument that's been made for about 1800 years. Christianity does have a legacy of anti-Semitism, and the last thing we want to do is add more schlock to that pile. The purpose of this series is to examine ancient Hebrew ideas and contextualize the fragmented and winding context that shape the beliefs informing the Christian nationalist narrative today. While this series will discuss harmful religious rhetoric, we do not mean to say that these ideas were destructive in their original contexts, and we further do not mean to imply that these beliefs would inevitably become toxic as they were passed down through history. Who knows what the ancient Hebrew cult of Christianity would have become if it weren't for centuries of twisted interpretations that in many cases intentionally scapegoated Jews, pagans, and even other Christians with deviating beliefs. Rome did this best, but Paul, a whole lot of Gentile Christians, and even Plato made their own contributions. And to understand how, let's hop in the Wayback Machine and set the dial to the 1st century CE. We're starting today with the first Gentile followers of Jesus. If we go back to the beginning, separating Christianity from Judaism doesn't make any sense. Christianity was Judaism, or more accurately, it was a sect within the Jewish world. Early on, because Jews lived all over the place and not just in Jerusalem, and because people were generally monolatrous, meaning they recognized all sorts of gods, worshipped their favorites, curious Gentile onlookers sometimes got interested in the Jewish faith. These folks would go to Jewish community centers, learn Jewish history, and participate to various degrees in Jewish law. They were called God-fearers, and they became a prime audience for early evangelists from the Jesus movement. In the years immediately after Jesus' death, there was no such thing as Christianity. Some people believed in Jesus' message and his resurrection, whatever that meant to them, and invested their lives in continuing his following, then called the Way. This was not initially a movement for Gentiles. Gentiles who were God-fearers and hung out in synagogues got exposed to it, though, and for a few reasons, they ended up being more susceptible to its message than a lot of Jews. One reason for this might have been that they already had their own gods that mimicked the resurrection myth. Orpheus, Dionysus, Osiris, and Persephone meant that resurrection made more sense to them than it did to many Jews. We'll see why in a later video when we get to the part of the series that covers the Messiah. Another reason could have been the ecstatic practices of early Jesus followers, speaking in tongues, getting possessed by the Spirit, engaging in frenzied movement and sound that overwhelmed the senses and suspended normal personal boundaries.
Life is like a hurricane.
It felt pretty Dionysian to a Greek imagination already steeped in ecstatic cults. Doesn't that dude look just like Jesus? All of this made Jesus following feel less like a foreign Jewish sect and more like a familiar Greco-Roman religious experience. And then there was Paul. Oh, Paul, the apostle we love, we hate, we pin the sins of Western Christianity on. Paul was a Jew. He existed fully in his own Jewishness. As he says in Romans, I myself am an Israelite, a descendant of Abraham, a member of the tribe of Benjamin. God has not rejected his people, whom he foreknew. But Paul didn't just spread the Jesus movement, he reframed it. He did not learn about Jesus' life or teachings before declaring himself an apostle, the best apostle, and going out to evangelize. He actually brags about this in Galatians, where he says, "For I did not receive it from any human source, nor was I taught it, but I received it through a revelation of Jesus Christ." He was educated, which in the first century Roman Empire meant he was trained in Greek philosophy and rhetoric, and that in turn means that Paul's interpretation of the significance of Jesus' death and his arguments about why everyone else should see it his way were crafted within and for the Greco-Roman mindset. The upshot was that his astonishingly successful ministry was also astonishingly successful in divorcing his own interpretation of Jesus' death from the very Jewish message of Jesus' life. In the end, and not to pile on Paul, even though Paul was Jewish, his interpretation and argumentation were the first step in moving a Jewish sect out of Jewish hands. So, with all these competing influences, personalities, and geographies, it shouldn't shock us that the early Jesus movement wasn't exactly unified. There were the original Jesus followers who actually knew Jesus the person in his life. There was Paul, and there was a plethora of churches founded across the Greco-Roman world, each with its own teachers, local traditions, mindsets, and needs. Not only that, but arguing/debating was native to both Jewish and Greek thought and practice. Here's a few juicy nuggets from Paul talking shit to the Jews who lived in Rome. "You who boast in the law dishonor God by breaking the law, for as it is written, the name of God is blasphemed among the Gentiles because of you." Here's another one. "But Israel, who pursued the law as a way of righteousness, has not attained it. Why not? Because they pursued it not by faith, but as if it were by works. The nerve of those Jews doing good works." Let's do another one. "But regarding Israel, God says, all day long I have held out my hands to a disobedient and obstinate people."
A bit of sass from the bar.
That one's Romans 10:21. Gentile Christians later took all this to mean that Jews were bad, but that wasn't it at all. All this was the normal course of a diverse community debating amongst itself about the correct interpretation of its history and the course for its future. Paul loved his people. It's just that his love language was aggressive midrash. Anyway, Gentiles did this too. Greek rhetoric was built on it. All that name-calling wasn't just Paul being Paul. This was how educated people argued. According to the scholar Paula Fredriksen, pagan rhetorical education had spread in the Hellenistic period after the conquest of Alexander the Great. The learned and the literate were trained in the art of oral argumentation, and the goal of oral exercise was not to present a fair picture of an opposing view, but to make one's own view as persuasively as possible. Indeed, the construction of a view as if it were opposing, the proverbial straw man, was itself a stratagem of agonistic rhetoric. In other words, to think like the educated class in the Greco-Roman world was to argue, and to argue was to win, not to reach consensus or gain greater understanding through opposing opinions, as nice as that might be. And this, the mixing of Jewish devotion with Greek rhetoric, set the stage for Gentile Christians to reinterpret the faith in ways its original Jewish followers never imagined. So yeah, there were a lot of Christianities going around, and they were not at peace. A side effect of this diverse thinking and arguing to win was that more and more over time, Gentile Christians began to define themselves as much by what they weren't as what they were. And what it eventually turned out they were definitely not was Jews. Why? Well, here's a couple possible reasons. They didn't want to be perpetual outsiders worshiping another culture's god. And they wanted to be chosen. Who doesn't, right? Some Gentile Christian thinkers went so far as to claim that the God of the Hebrew Bible was not the God Jesus worshipped. The Hebrew God, they said, was a lower God, maybe even a demon, and Jesus' ministry was about unveiling a higher and more pure, true God. And this is where we cross paths with Plato. See, there was this whole Hellenistic line of thinking that said whatever God was, it was distant, unchangeable, and absolutely distinct from the material world. In fact, the physical world was so inherently low and corrupt that the Most High spiritual God could have had nothing to do with creating it and would never have contaminated himself by interfering with it. Jesus was a bridge between the unknowable, untouchable, pure, and holy God and base humanity. Jesus' resurrection was meant to signal the elect's eventual separation from the filthy physical realm. There was even an argument about whether Jesus had a body, and if he did, whether or not he pooped. Most importantly for our point, however, was the Gentile line of argumentation that went, Jews may be Israel, but they are only gross, fleshy Israel. We Gentile Christians who don't need Jewish law and don't circumcise ourselves are spiritual Israel, and therefore God's true elect. They used Paul's letters to support this line of argumentation, and if you read Paul's letters, you'll see why that was easy to do. And why that's too bad for Paul, who really was a Jew and really did love his people. Then, into this already chaotic argumentative landscape walks the biggest empire in the Western world, the Romans. If we were to point at a real culprit for Christian nationalism, and by Christian nationalism we mean the conflation of Christian rhetoric with national identity, plus the use of government to enforce Christian identity and values in a way that often overlaps with authoritarianism and white supremacy, we would blame Rome. We would not blame the ancient Hebrews. All right. In the year 312, the Roman Emperor Constantine converted to Christianity. Many Christians have learned to see this as a good thing, but this was not a good thing. Before this point, the world was pagan, meaning the world was populated by various culturally specific gods. It was in any empire's best interest to support this plurality. It kept the gods happy, and keeping the gods happy kept the peace. The conversion of an aggressively colonial empire to a monotheistic system, albeit in the ancient monolatrous sense, was not good news. It was oppressive. All this intra-faith Judeo-Greek argument about the right way to follow the way became an absolute right way backed by the might of armed legions. More than that, it took a vested interest in defining wrong ways, labeling them as heretical, and violently stamping them out. Many Christians love to dwell on all the early oppression they suffered. Here at the Twisted Testament, half of us grew up Catholic, and that half knows a thing or two about martyrs. But the real oppression happened by Christians to Christians, and Jews, and the people who were variously defined as pagans by the empire and its weaponized church. This is the direct predecessor of Christian nationalism today. One codified set of Christian ideas as a national identity and tool of the state for authoritarian oppression. Not ancient Hebrew tribes trying to figure out their world in the midst of great suffering. And that's the real point of this series. When we explore ancient ideas, we don't want you to think, aha, well, here's where all the bad stuff comes from. We want you to think, oh, that's familiar, but also completely different from how I learned it or how I see it in practice today. We also want you to think, gee, this stuff made a lot of sense a few thousand years ago in this specific culture and time. That sure isn't how it's being used now. We also want you to think, holy shit, this is crazy how a specifically Jewish faith has been twisted to become so unrecognizable that people could use it to blame and persecute Jews for approximately 1800 years. And while we learn more about Hebrew antiquity and we recognize stories that have morphed into harmful rhetoric, and we wonder who's to blame, who should we criticize for the harm done by these ideas? Remember, the answer is ancient Rome. We should always criticize ancient Rome. If you ever hear someone praising Rome and talking about how it's the source of all the meaningful thought and invention in our world, you might warn them that they're starting to sound like some brand of authoritarian white supremacist.
Our lineage and our legacy hails back to Athens, to Rome, to Philadelphia, to Monticello. Our ancestors built the cities. They produced the art and architecture. They built the industry. We are the ones who build. We are the ones who create. We are the ones who lift up humanity.
That guy sucks. It's not Hebrew culture that got us here. It's not Jesus' teaching that got us here. It was the process of wresting Jesus away from his Jewish identity, cleansing the religion of his Jewish teachings, and merging it with the political agenda of the state that wields it that got us here. Identifying its ancient heritage and context is what gets us free. Thank you for sharing this time with us. Check out our Substack linked in the description. And if you enjoyed this, go ahead and tickle that like button. If you didn't, tell us about it in the comments. You can tell us good things in the comments too. We like hearing good things. This is just the first in the series, so if you want to join us for the rest, go ahead and click that bell to be notified in about a month or so when we continue to explore this fascinating topic of Christian nationalism and its ancient precedents. In the meantime, learn lots, share your thoughts, and try your best to be good.
What? What?